Well, there's lots that could be said. Let me just zero in on one element. I was 17 years old. I was invited to go to an evening conference. And at that conference, I heard the gospel preached for the first time. I'd been raised in a religious family, but I'd never heard the gospel. And that night, there was a deep conviction immediately that came upon me of being lost and of deeply thirsting for salvation and for a relationship with God. And that evening, the conference speaker, who I discovered later was an evangelist, invited us to come forward, and I gave my life to Christ. In the 15 years after that, that evangelist who had come from France and who was an Algerian, so here's an Algerian, he had met Christ in Algeria and had been displaced to France, as many Algerians were, and had come years later to preach the gospel in Quebec as an itinerant evangelist. He has brought hundreds and hundreds of Quebecois to Christ. He passed away just 7 years ago. Well, here I am just a couple weeks ago now, celebrating a wedding for a friend, a Spanish-speaking friend. So celebrating a wedding in a Spanish-speaking congregation on the island of Notre Dame here in Montreal, where Expo 67 was celebrated. In fact, the celebration was in the garden of the Pavilion du Canada. Expo 67, as you will remember, really transformed Quebec, opened us to the nations. And the history of the gospel in Quebec, of the recent history of the gospel, really turns around Expo 67. That's another story. But here I am, celebrating Christian marriage and explaining Christianity and what a Christian marriage is and presenting Christ, when at the end of the ceremony, a couple comes forward, an older man, a little older than my wife and I, and starts chatting with us, and he says to me, you know, as I was hearing you preach in this whole celebration, it reminded me of a cousin. He says, you know, I'm from Algeria. I've been working here in Quebec. He says this to me in French, obviously, with a perfect French. And he says, this celebration, this wedding today, reminds me of a cousin that I haven't seen for years. You know, when I was young, I had this cousin who converted to Protestantism. And, you know, we never knew why. But isn't that a funny story? And today reminds me of that. And then I asked him what was his name. He gives me his cousin's name, and it was the name of the evangelist who 36 years ago brought me to Christ. And he told me what the name of his cousin was, raised in a Muslim home, and how this evangelist had changed his name so that he would fit into France better. And so isn't that amazing how God in his sovereignty moves nations around and moves people to have a heart for other nations, like this Algerian who's had become a French citizen and became an itinerant evangelist and came to Quebec and brought Jean Martin to the Lord by God's grace. And 36 years later, I have the privilege of preaching Christ to his cousin who had missed the message many, many years back and who's still wondering. We never understood why he came to Protestantism. And I told him, well, he came to Christ, first of all. And I shared my testimony with him. And we'll be having coffee again soon with my wife and this man and his wife, and to explain again and to go over. So amazing how God is the God of the nations, and how already 36 years ago, it's not a recent phenomenon, already 36 years ago, God was at work in moving the nations towards Quebec, and today moving Quebec towards the nations.